In this video, I'm going to introduce you to alternation of generations, and I'll explain how it applies to algae and seedless plants. This topic is part of a series of modules. In the earlier modules, we introduced some of the terms and underlying concepts that will now be applied to this particular lesson. This includes the processes of mitosis and meiosis, and their role in the growth and gamete production in an animal life cycle. In this lesson, the learning objectives are as follows. First, we'll describe the alternation of generations life cycle. While doing so, we'll distinguish between gametes and spores, as well as the difference between gametophytes and sporophytes. We'll also describe the role of meiosis and mitosis for the different stages and for the production of reproductive propagules. Next, we'll distinguish between isomorphic and dimorphic alternation of generations life cycles. This will be followed by distinguishing between gametophyte and sporophyte dominance. We'll finish up this lesson by applying these concepts to compare and contrast a moss life cycle with a fern life cycle. So let's jump into that first objective, to describe the alternation of generations life cycle and to learn about the associated structures and processes that are involved. Before starting, however, I do want to briefly remind you of the animal life cycle, which is a diploid life cycle. This is the life cycle that most people are familiar with. In this life cycle, the multicellular organism is diploid. That is, it has two homologous sets of every chromosome. Through the process of meiosis, gametes are produced. These are single-celled reproductive propagules that are haploid. These propagules cannot continue to live on their own. They must fuse with another compatible reproductive propagule through the process of fertilization, otherwise they will die. Following fertilization, a diploid zygote is produced, which is able to undergo mitosis to produce a new multicellular organism, and this completes the life cycle. In contrast, I now want to introduce a very different life cycle, one that is more complex and counterintuitive. To demonstrate it, I'm going to start by providing the life cycle of a hypothetical organism that perhaps I found somewhere. When studying this organism, I discovered that it was diploid. Upon maturity, this organism underwent meiosis to produce single-celled haploid reproductive propagules. It turned out that these reproductive propagules were not eggs and sperm. In fact, they did not fuse with any other compatible reproductive propagules. Instead, each of these cells underwent mitosis to give rise to a new organism that was haploid. Upon maturity, these individuals produce gametes through the process of mitosis. These gametes can fuse with a gamete from another haploid organism through the process of fertilization, resulting in a diploid zygote. The zygote then underwent mitosis, giving rise to the next generation, which was once again diploid. So in this regards, the organism has an alternation of generations. It has one generation that is diploid, followed by a haploid generation, which is then again followed by a diploid generation, and this continues on between every generation. It turns out that this life cycle is not actually alien at all. In fact, this is the life cycle of plants and many algae. I will demonstrate this using the life cycle of ulva. Ulva is a green seaweed that you find in the ocean. It produces leafy structures that are multicellular and diploid. They will undergo meiosis to produce single-celled reproductive propagules that are haploid. These are not eggs nor sperm. They do not fuse with another reproductive propagule. Instead, they undergo mitosis to give rise to new multicellular organisms. Because of this, we call these spores. The plant that produces them are called the sporophyte. Phyte means plant, so this name literally means the plant that produces spores. As mentioned, the spores will undergo mitosis, giving rise to a multicellular individual that is haploid. This is the individual that will produce gametes through the process of mitosis. We call this particular plant the gametophyte. That is, the plant that produces the gametes. If another haploid individual produces compatible gametes, then the gametes can fuse through the process of fertilization, creating a diploid zygote. This zygote will then undergo mitosis to grow into a new sporophyte. If you go scuba diving or snorkeling in an area where these algae grow, you can often see numerous individuals growing on the ocean floor. Some of these will be diploid generations, while others will be haploid. Before moving on, we'll quickly recap some of the terms we have just covered. A gamete is a haploid reproductive cell that must fuse with another compatible reproductive cell to produce a diploid zygote. If they do not fuse, these cells will perish. Gametes typically include eggs and sperm. In contrast, a spore is a haploid reproductive cell that undergoes mitosis to give rise to a multicellular generation. Spores do not fuse with other reproductive cells. Similarly, a gametophyte is the plant generation that produces gametes, whereas a sporophyte is the plant generation that produces spores. Moving on to our next learning objective, we will now distinguish between isomorphic and dimorphic alternation of generations. Isomorphic means that the gametophyte and the sporophyte look the same. In contrast, dimorphic means that the gametophyte and sporophyte look quite different. Let's see how this applies to some of the plant life cycles. Starting with ulva, we have an isomorphic life cycle. The gametophyte and the sporophyte look the same, but not all plants have this. In some cases, the gametophyte is highly reduced. This is a dimorphic life cycle, two different forms between the sporophyte and the gametophyte. In other cases, it is the sporophyte that is highly reduced instead. At this point, I encourage you to pause the video and complete activities 1 to 3 of the class handout. To complete this lesson, we'll now finish our last two learning objectives. We'll distinguish between gametophyte and sporophyte dominance. Following, we will compare and contrast a moss life cycle and a fern life cycle. While doing this, we will answer the following questions. Which stage is the dominant stage? Are all the gametes released into the environment, or is at least one type of the gamete retained within a specialized structure? And if so, how does this influence the relationship between the sporophyte and the gametophyte? Generation dominance refers to a single generation that is more conspicuous, independent, and occupies the longest portion of the life cycle. So let's see how this principle applies to mosses and ferns. Many of you may be familiar with mosses as these very small leafy green plants. It turns out that these are actually haploid, so they are the gametophyte. Gametophytes produce sperm in specialized structures called antheridia. Sperm are dispersed through water, and they are motile. They will swim towards and fertilize egg cells. Egg cells are produced in archegonia. These egg cells are retained, so upon fertilization, a zygote will develop within the archegonium. As a zygote continues to develop, it will grow into a young sporophyte, still contained within and dependent upon the gametophyte for its nourishment. Eventually, these sporophytes will develop a long stalk with a capsule at the end. These are the generation that will produce spores. They have a structure called a sporangium that will release spores into the environment, which will then germinate and restart the life cycle by growing into the haploid gametophytes. Now let's compare this to a fern life cycle. Many of us are familiar with ferns as these large, beautiful leafy plants with fronds. The plant that you see is diploid, therefore it is the sporophyte. The sporophyte produces spores. These spores will grow into the haploid gametophyte. Most people will never see a fern gametophyte because these are very tiny. You often need a magnifying glass or a microscope to be able to view it. Similar to mosses, the sperm are produced in a structure called the antheridium, and the sperm are dispersed through water. They will swim towards and fertilize the egg cell. Again, similar to mosses, the egg cells are produced in the structure called an archegonium, and upon fertilization, a diploid zygote is formed. This zygote will develop within the archegonium, eventually giving rise to a new sporophyte. This sporophyte is thus attached to the gametophyte. Sporophytes are much longer lived than gametophytes, so eventually the gametophyte will die and disintegrate, and the sporophyte will continue living independently. Thus, ferns actually have independent sporophytes and gametophytes. The sporophyte is only temporarily dependent upon the gametophyte during the early development after fertilization. Once again, I encourage you to pause this video and now complete activities 4 to 5 of the class handout. In summary, in this video, we learned that alternation of generations is the life cycle that occurs in plants and certain algae. It involves the subsequent alternation of haploid and diploid generations. Diploid sporophytes produce haploid spores through meiosis. Spores undergo mitosis to produce a haploid generation, called the gametophyte. These haploid gametophytes produce gametes through mitosis. Gametes must fuse to produce a diploid zygote, which will then undergo mitosis to produce the next diploid generation of sporophytes. Depending on the type of plant or algae, the relationship between the haploid and diploid generations can be as following. Both can be free-living, like we saw with ulva. One generation can be fully dependent upon the other generation, like we saw with the moss. Or both can have free-living generations, but one generation is temporarily dependent upon the other generation, like we saw with the ferns. Isomorphic alternation of generations has similar-looking gametophytes and sporophytes, both of which are separate and free-living individuals. Dimorphic alternation of generations has different-looking gametophytes and sporophytes, one which is the dominant generation and one which is not. In land plants, one generation is retained by the previous generation. In mosses, the gametophyte is the dominant generation and the sporophyte is completely dependent upon the gametophyte. In contrast, in ferns, the sporophyte is the dominant generation and it is temporarily dependent upon the gametophyte.